Well, good Thursday morning, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. We're going through Acts chapter 7 this week. I hope you've been with us. But this is the speech that Stephen, the first Christian martyr, because that's how this story is going to end, he was before the Sanhedrin, and they are accusing him of blaspheming Moses and the law. And he responds with telling the whole history of the Old Testament and how that God has sent them many prophets and leaders through the years, and they've turned and disobeyed all of them. And now God has sent the ultimate prophet, the Messiah, to them, Jesus, and they're turning away from him too. So that's his argument. We're going to pick it back up at 20. And Moses, it's the story of Moses, and I think you'll know it. You remember it from the Old Testament. But it says at Acts 7, verse 20, at that time, Moses was born, for he was no ordinary child. And so he's laying the groundwork that he is a prophet. And well, you'll hear it. For 3 months, he was cared for in his father's house. And when he was placed outside, and remember where he was placed? In the Nile River. And Pharaoh's daughter took him and brought him up as her own son. Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and action. And we're going to drop down to, because this is Stephen has a long speech, and we're not going to be able to read it all. I encourage you to do so. But in verse 37, this is that Moses who told the Israelites, God will send you a prophet like me from your own people. And he's referring, of course, to the Messiah who turned out to be Jesus. He was in the assembly in the desert when the angel who spoke to him on Mount Sinai, and with our fathers, he received living words to pass on to us. Verse 39, but our fathers refused to obey him. Instead, they rejected him and in their hearts turned back to Egypt. They told Aaron, Moses' brother, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who led us out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him. That was the time that they made an idol in the form of a calf. They brought sacrifices to it and held a celebration in honor of what their hands have made. You remember all that story. But God turned away and gave them over to the worship of the heavenly bodies. This agrees with what is written in the book of the prophets. And so Stephen's argument is that they turned away. Moses was there and they turned away. And remember how many times in the desert, that's why they wandered for 40 years. So many times. This was the first, but they didn't listen and obey as God had instructed them to do. That's a great example, wasn't it, that Stephen was using of when God spoke, they didn't listen. That whole Testament story, though, and he goes on, and we'll read more tomorrow. In fact, tomorrow we'll talk about the one thing that God did for Stephen that he has done for very, very, very few people in the history of the world. And you won't want to miss tomorrow. But as I had also mentioned, and one of the things we've been looking at this week is that when critics and people who want to disprove the Bible, they look at this speech and they try to find ways that Stephen was inaccurate. And if he was inaccurate while speaking under the Holy Spirit, then the Bible, they say, is inaccurate. And that is not something that Orthodox Christianity believes. And if you read the doctrinal statement of most churches, and of course Saddleback, They believe in the inerrancy of the Bible. So when the Bible seems to contradict itself, how should we react? Well, let's look at the one today that I just read. And that was in verse 22. And it says, Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptian and was powerful in speech and in action. And yet, do you remember what Moses said it was actually recorded in Exodus 4, verse 10. And he described himself, and in fact, he was making an excuse to God. I can't go and confront Pharaoh. Why? Because I am slow of speech. Lord, I can't go because I am slow of speech. And do you remember what happened? God gives him Aaron, his brother, and they go together. And Aaron seemingly is the one who speaks to Pharaoh through the whole time of the 10 plagues. So, who's right? And can they both be right? It seems that Stephen is saying that Moses is an excellent speaker. And he's powerful in speech. And yet, Old Testament, Moses says, I am slow of speech. There's several answers, and the answer is not that the Bible contradicts itself. God, the Holy Spirit, can't contradict himself. Now, granted, we're starting with that presupposition, but there are such logical answers to every one of apparent contradictions in the Bible. And if you ever come across one, just admit that on the surface it says that, but then research it, and you'll find possible answers. And there are possible answers in this case for sure. Because you see, let me give you just two. One is that when Moses spoke through Aaron, even if he was speaking through Aaron, he was powerful in speech. Maybe Aaron, as he said Moses's words for him, was a more fluent speaker. And by the way, that's another question here. It doesn't say that Stephen wasn't saying that he was fluent and a great speaker. He's saying he is powerful in speech, and he certainly was in action. So that's certainly an excellent solution right there. That maybe Stephen is just referring to the words of Moses that were spoken through Aaron. He's not contradicting that. But another great option is that Moses didn't have a good estimation of himself. And I know a lot of times, I know it's happened to you. You think, well, I'm not good enough to do such and such. And yet you are. Or you ask, why would God call me to something? Surely he can find somebody better. And I think that was Moses's feeling for sure. But he might not have been accurate. Maybe he was a great speaker. And once he got going, certainly when he was leading the Israelites and they had come out of Egypt, he wasn't speaking through Aaron any longer. He was mighty in speech and in powerful speech. It's just that the Hebrews didn't listen. So it's very clear to me, no one argued with Stephen on that point. Moses, as Stephen said, was powerful. Now we're going to see tomorrow. We're going to wrap the whole thing up tomorrow. I sure hope you don't miss it. It's going to be a good one. Bye for now.
And I won't worry about tomorrow.